Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Good morning, SmartHER News. Welcome to our weekly debrief. This is our deep breath when it comes to the news. Of course, SmartHER News is always dedicated to quick, concise, nonpartisan information, but every once in a while, we have to spread out what we mean by concise. And instead of 3 minutes, maybe we could talk for about 30 minutes on some of the big stories of the week and take your questions. And that's what we try to do here. So we're broadcasting live on Instagram, as we're also recording audio for those that want to watch and listen later on YouTube and podcasting platforms everywhere. But it was a really interesting week in the world of SmartHER News. We had to adjust a couple things. So I thought I would start off with that because I was able to do something I haven't been able to do in a really long time. And that is step in front of a big crowd and talk about what we're doing here. And over the course of the last couple of years, of course, we had the pandemic. That certainly prevented some travel. I also had a baby. That also prevented some travel. And the media environment has also really changed. So I was really excited about this opportunity, although I was a little bit nervous. So this happened earlier in the week in Philadelphia. And there's actually a tie into the news here, which is going to be woven in. I hope if I can succeed here. But I was able to speak in front of a group of a couple hundred but basically a crowd that has a financial background. And there was a company called Private Advisor Group. And one of our friends is the co-founder of that company. But it's quite a big company, so you can't just get invited by your friends. You have to actually have something to add. And so we were scheduled to do this talk for several months. It kept getting canceled and delayed. In fact, it was last year when this was first established. And I was able to do this speaking engagement with my husband. My husband is a leadership instructor. He's written some leadership books. He's a former Navy SEAL. So this was new. It was new for us to travel together. It was the first time away from our kids since the pandemic started, for both at the same time on a plane. We hadn't done that sort of a trip yet. Of course, I have a 2-year-old, so that also was a factor. The changing economic environment has certainly been a factor. My husband's been traveling a lot, so he's usually the one that's traveling. I'm usually the one at home. And that's how we've done this dance for a couple of years. So this was the first time for me to get on the plane, to get somewhere, to get to an event and talk a little bit about effective storytelling, which was my topic, and really talk a little bit about SmartHER News. So this was a lot of fun. And it was great to be in the city of Philadelphia for this. And there was a theme there that keeps coming up for me. It kept coming up in the company, how they were speaking to their community that they've developed over several decades. But also because we're in Philadelphia, one of the first major U.S. cities, the place where the U.S. Constitution was written, where all of the people that we know from our history have walked down the streets. And I really feel that when I'm there. You see old buildings. We were right around the corner from a church that's, older than the state of Texas. It's just the history of Philadelphia is just amazing. And it got me thinking a lot about freedom. One of the things that the company that we were speaking for does is that they support other financial advisors. So let's say you're a financial advisor, you're running a wealth management firm, you have a couple employees, but you want to be sort of tethered to a larger organization that can support you. That's what this company does, Private Advisor Group does. And so really what that group is doing is providing freedom to its community so that they could really focus on what they can do best, which is interfacing with their clients. If you're running your own business, one of the things that you want to do is provide freedom for your clients or your customers or your audience. And that's something I really thought about regarding SmartHER News. One of the things that I think we can provide is try to free up your schedule. 24 hours news is a new concept, and it hasn't always been that way. I also, even though I worked in 24-hour news, I'm not sure that's really the best way to consume information or deliver information. And so one of the things I want for you is freedom. I want you to be able to feel secure that you're going to get the news from some place that's trustworthy and nonpartisan, and then live your life. Live your life. Live your story, whatever that story is. Don't get trapped into, hours and hours of consuming news. That distracts you from the other things that are really important. That said, as a journalist, I think the news is important. These headlines are intersecting in our own lives in very personal ways, and they impact the story of our lives as well. But we have to have balance. You have to have balance among those things. So I was thinking a lot about that in Philadelphia, freedom. Really, ultimately, that is the mark of a really healthy relationship, whether it's professionally or personally. If you're in a customer service industry, which I believe the news industry is, I want you to have more freedom. I want to lighten the load for you. If you're in a relationship with someone, whether it's a friendship or romantic relationship, it's always great to be with someone that makes you feel more free, that you can be more yourself, that you can pursue your dreams. So we really got to refocus, right? We got to refocus some of the stories that we're talking about, including the ones we're talking about today. Really, a lot of them have themes about freedom, and what does freedom look like today? What is true personal liberty? You've heard me talk a lot about that. Whether we're talking about, vaccine mandates or we're talking about foreign policy, there's a tendency to get really down in the details. That's important, but we got to zoom way out and say, hey, what is this really about? What is this story really about? We want to pursue our happiest, our most free lives. And how does that story affect this? So that's sort of the theme that I'm going to tackle today. I wasn't expecting to see this story. By the way, this week has a variety of news. We have so many different stories this week, which is a nice change. I feel like over the last couple of weeks, we've really had, repetition of a lot of key stories and developments, but this has a smattering. We have a week of a smattering of a lot of different information. So I'm going to actually start with something that probably is no longer leading the evening broadcast of news, but I think is one of the most fascinating stories of the week, and one that I kind of stumbled upon unexpectedly on Sunday night. The Supreme Court is repeatedly hearing different cases. We don't get the decisions from the Supreme Court until the end of their term. So that's usually not until early summer. And that's why you get like a flurry of Supreme Court decisions at one time, because there's not like a case and then a decision and a case and a decision. They hear a bunch of cases and then we get their decisions. And so that is, that's something different than when you're watching Law and Order. Right? And so the case that started off the week that the Supreme Court heard was a case that has been bouncing around a variety of different courts for the last several years. This case made it to the Supreme Court at one time, and the Supreme Court was like, no, it's not ready for us yet. Bounced it back down to a lower court, and then now it's back again at the Supreme Court. And here's how Philadelphia ties into this. This case really centers around the Constitution. It's a story of a U.S. high school football coach and his desire to pray on the field after a football game. So let me give you a little bit of a backstory on this, because if I just give you that plot line, instantly it's like, well, we all go to our corners. You should have seen me talking to my husband about this. My husband is from Texas. He's a Christian and he played football. And in Texas, there's no line dividing any of that. Can I get an amen from the Texans out there? I'm from California. There might be a little bit different football culture, although I'll say I went to a Christian Brothers school, high school in San Francisco, right in the heart of the city. And I was thinking about this morning. When we played other schools that would be our rivals that also were Christian, I think there was a prayer before we started the game, right in the middle of Golden Gate Park, where we played at Kezar Stadium. I seem to be, it's been a long time, guys. It's been a long time since I was in the high school football stands. I was, trying to participate in the crowd, but I think that's what we did. Anyhow, we'll all have a point of reference on this. So here's a little bit of the backstory. Joseph Kennedy is a high school football coach, and just a little background on him, had a really tough upbringing. So he's very passionate about mentorship to young men. He finds his way to the football field through like different twists and turns. And when he gets this assistant coaching position, he ends up watching a movie that inspires him. He's already turned towards his faith because of a really tough time in his marriage. And he's a Christian, and he's decided, I'm going to honor God for this opportunity that I have now to coach and mentor young men. So let's go back to the 2000s. He starts coaching. At the end of the game, he would go to the 50-yard line. And apparently the way that it's described is that he would quickly kneel, say a prayer, and keep on moving. This happened for years. This happened for actually like 7 years, 8 years, about 7 years. And this became a tradition. So after the game, he would go say a short prayer, and sometimes players would join him. Sometimes players from the other team would join him. And this started to get a little attention. So at a certain point, the school district didn't like this and felt that he shouldn't do it on the field, that in some ways it was a conflict because he was a public school football coach and that it was in some way advocating or promoting religion in a way that the district thought was not appropriate or perhaps even legal. So they ask him to stop. He ends up stopping temporarily, but then he picks back up again, and he's actually challenging it. And he's saying, no, I'm an American. I'm able to express my religion and my opinion, and I'm going to continue to do this. Well, the two sides sort of face off, and it's not that he's fired on the spot. At the end of the season, the school recommends not to rehire him. He doesn't reapply, and then he ends up filing a lawsuit against the district and says that his First Amendment rights have been violated. Now, the school says, listen, we're not keeping you from wanting to pray privately or at all. We just think that you're a representative of the district. And when you're doing this, students are feeling pressured that if they don't join you, that they're somehow going to be punished. And in this way, we don't think it's appropriate. What Joe Kennedy says is, this is, I'm not a representative of any sort of the district or the government or the state or any of that. At the end of the game is over, it's no longer a school event. I'm doing this very briefly. I'm not telling anyone that they have to join me. And this is something that's really important to me. So those are, broad strokes, but those are basically both sides of it. One of the things I thought was really important in this story is how long did the prayer last? It's a different scenario to me as a journalist, having not seen this. Was it a 5-minute prayer at the middle of the field, or was it a 10-minute prayer? How big was the crowd? I wanted to know all of these things. Apparently, according to a couple different reports, these prayers would last less than a minute. So it's very brief. And that might be a factor in all of this. So this brings up a question about the separation of church and state. One of the arguments from the district is, hey, Coach Kennedy, you actually represent the government as this public high school football coach, and you are an agent of the state. And by the way, we have separation of church and state, so this is open and shut. But that's not the case necessarily. And that's even though repeatedly, Coach Kennedy has lost in lower courts, he still is getting his appeals accepted about getting this case looked at again. And so now it's at the Supreme Court. So interesting what happened at the Supreme Court on Monday. We get a little bit of insight onto this. The justices had some really fascinating questions to ask. And we get a couple of these quotes. So one of the things that Justice Clarence Thomas asked is whether or not if Coach Kennedy took a knee, instead of taking a knee midfield after the game, if he took a knee during the national anthem, if he would meet the same fate, if he'd actually get the same criticism, that he was trying to promote a certain sort of political or religious belief, which is what this separation of church and state is supposed to be about. By the way, really important about separation of church and state. One of our audience members pointed this out to me this week, and I think this is really critical. We talk about separation of church and state commonly as Americans, but the reality is that the term separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. And in fact, some interpret how the First Amendment was written to specifically mean a separation of the federal government from any sort of meddling in religious affairs or promoting a religion. A federal government religion. In the years after the Constitution was passed, states also took that stance, that also applied to them, that there was no going to be, a state religion, that is against or violates the Constitution. But exactly where the line is drawn between how the government separates church and state, how we interpret that, has been the subject of many different court cases over the years. And our common understanding of it, or what is accepted, is really according to recent legal precedent. And this is why there's always room to change, because you can set a different legal precedent, right? We don't pray in school. We don't do certain things in school. But can a teacher still talk about their religion or their political beliefs? How far can a teacher go? This is just an example. I mean, there's a lot of different examples of church and state that don't have to do just specifically with the school. But it is important to know that there's no specific language saying there's a separation of church and state. This is the interpretation of the Constitution, and whether or not what the founders meant by that exactly, whether it was written on purpose to prevent something like a scenario of prayer during a public high school football game or after the end of one, is the matter of this court case. So this is what the Supreme Court, I call them the Supremes. I like calling them that. The Supremes, the Supreme Court justices are taking a look at. Justice Alito had another question during the hearing, and he said, well, if this coach was holding a Ukrainian flag today, would you think that violated his opportunity to express himself as a state agent? So you see that the justices are using different scenarios. They're trying to like poke a little bit around this. Justice Kagan, though, came out and said she felt that these were the right questions to ask, that the school district was asking the right thing because students were feeling compelled. And the pressure part of it about whether or not a student felt compelled to have to participate in prayer because they would be punished otherwise is a key part of this case as well. This will be interesting. Will the Supreme Court go against all the lower courts' rulings? Will they establish something new when it comes to what is allowed in different scenarios as we evolve and we have different scenarios come up where maybe church and state is at some sort of conflict? I'm really curious what you think about this. Just a note of something I learned. My father was an NFL quarterback. I don't know if we've ever talked about that. Some of you are new. You may not know. I've had him on as an interviewee on SmartHER News periodically, sometimes around Super Bowl time. My father played in Super Bowl IV, just to give you an idea. So this is back when the NFL first started. And here's another fun fact. My father actually made less as an NFL football player than my mother as a public school teacher. He actually worked in the off season. So it was a different world. So you got to be careful when you say my father was an NFL quarterback, because then you guys think I'm driving around in Mercedes. You know what I mean? It was a little bit different back then. So I come from football is what I'm trying to say. However, I just, I was really inspired by this story. I was like, this is a great news story because there's so many different sides, and we can take a look at the Constitution. We can do a little history in here. These are the stories I live for at SmartHER News. You can tell I'm really excited about this. I started talking about it with my husband. I'm like, this is an amazing case. Take a listen to this. Don't do that if you want to go to sleep, because my husband got all fired up about this. He was very passionate that this coach had every right to pray at the end of a game. But there are those that are equally passionate, including one of the student body, I think he was student body president, I can't be sure, at the time of this happening. Because this all happened between like 2007, 2008, in 2015. And remember, the coach had been praying for many years before it actually became a legal issue. But this is the time period of it. He hasn't coached at the school for a while. So I was looking back at some older articles, and one of the students invited a satanic group to the football games because trying to prove the point that if we're going to allow one coach to pray at the end of a game, then others have to be welcomed. This is why the district was like, we're going to have to figure this out. So we'll see what the Supreme Court decides on this. There's a little background. This is nice because we should have a shorter period of time before we get to hear what their decision is going to be. But what do you think about this? It's a very interesting story, and just proof that, sometimes the legal process, we don't need proof on that. We know the legal process can take a while. So there you go. So that's an interesting story, and one we'll continue to watch at SmartHER News. Okay, a couple housekeeping items. I want to talk to you a little bit about some news that is, again, kind of a smattering across a couple different areas. And they all are interconnected in some ways. The economy, what's going on with COVID. However, I'm not just talking about COVID. I'm talking about another mysterious virus that's affecting children. We're going to get to that. And also I want to talk to you about this Russian prisoner swap that took place this week. And these are going to attach to larger headlines. So this will give us like little things to know that then get us to the bigger picture. Let's just start with the economy. We had a reading on the economy today, and I'll do this real quick. There's nothing that makes you more excited than economic data. I know it's easy to suddenly start to get that kind of, you kind of drift off, let your mind drift off into other things. But here's the bottom line. We got a reading on the U.S. economy that showed the economy shrunk in the first quarter. We don't want to see any economy shrink. We want to see us continue to grow. We'd like to see us continue to grow probably more than, 2%. That's pretty healthy. When it's a little bit lower than that always raises some eyebrows. But we were lower, we were in the negative territory. And so sometimes the reason why we pay attention to this is that if you have two consecutive quarters, so 2 3-month periods where you see negative growth, that can be the first signs of a recession. And so we watch that because traditionally that's where we would use that data. Okay, we got one quarter Let's see, do we get it a second time? And does that mean that the US economy is going through a sustained contraction, which is something that we don't want to see. Recession's not good, really. We don't want to see, we want to see growth. However, there seems to be a little bit of a moderated freak out over this. Couple things. We get a couple readings of this data. So this is the first one, which is what really gets attention. This normally doesn't get wildly revised, but it could. What is giving economists some sense of not freak out is that they're saying part of the reason why the economy is not able to grow is an inventory issue. So it's not because consumers aren't spending or, companies aren't trying to function. It's just a matter of the goods getting to people and making them available to buy. You were the key economic metric for economists overall, all over the world, by the way. I know many of you are watching from abroad. Thank you very much. We love seeing SmartHER News all over the world. The majority of our audience, of course, is American. And the American consumer, specifically, by the way, the woman consumer, is what's really being watched to see how healthy are you? Are you shopping? Are you continuing to invest in the economy? Are you really pulling back because of higher gas prices? What's going on with the economy in Russia? What is holding you back? Right now, the consumer, the American consumer, and by the way, when we look at consumer data, it's not broken down according to gender, is that you look okay. Like you look like you're doing okay. Despite all that's been thrown at you over the last, let's say, couple of years, you seem to be hanging in okay. If the U.S. consumer seems to be hanging in okay with the data, then we can see, well, maybe the economy's not growing as much, but it's not because the consumer's beat up. It's just because we got these other factors in it. So we'll see how that kind of shakes out as we get more data. But politically speaking, if you're the Biden administration, you're going into the midterm elections, these sort of data points are important because for Republicans, they're going to say, well, this isn't just an inventory issue. This is a policy issue, right? We had the wrong policies in place, and this is why we're confronting this. Democrats will say, no, that's not the case. We're dealing with a historic time and historic challenges, and we're still kind of trying to smooth out what's happening when it comes to inventories and deliveries and shipping and all of that. And by the way, that's not our fault because look at what's going on in Eastern Europe. So you're going to get these two arguments. These are going to develop, but here's just kind of a snapshot of them. Okay, let's talk a little bit about COVID. We haven't really talked a lot about the pandemic. We've seen somewhat of a rise in cases over the last couple weeks. We think that's due to an Omicron variant. But in general, we're not seeing the huge flashing warning signs of the hospitalizations that are leading to deaths. Now, we always have to be cautious with that because we know data is severely delayed when it comes to anything pandemic related. But so far, that's what we're seeing right now. We got this new study from the CDC this week that showed, almost 60% of Americans, they believe, has had a past prior infection of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID. They think 75% of children and adolescents have specifically prior infection. This is not that you necessarily got sick, but that you were infected with the virus. This is not that you were vaccinated. It's reading something completely different. And so that tells us something that the country has had a lot of exposure to this virus. The place that we're at now is that we're seeing Moderna come out and they're saying we would like to get an approval for our vaccine for the very youngest among us. We know that Pfizer's been trying to do that. And we're at this point with the pandemic where we've really focused so much on vaccinations and data that we've really not talked a lot about therapies. One of the things, just stepping back from this time period, and this is a fact, the fact is that we have seen that people can have multiple infections of COVID. You can get COVID even though you've been vaccinated. We've seen this. We see this in the data. And so now one of the things I really want to shift to at SmartHER News is really talking about treatment. Dr. Rutland brought up a really interesting point. I was speaking to him just the other day. One of the reasons I like talking to Dr. Rutland, he's a critical care physician. He's a pulmonologist. He's the guy that treats the people with respiratory viruses that get really sick. And that's exactly who you want to talk to about this. So he's treated long COVID. He's treated really severe cases. He's also treated very mild cases. And one of the things he has repeatedly talked about is that he feels that the government needs to talk more about treatments, monoclonal antibodies. What about these antiviral pills? And one of the things he said to me, and he said it as well in a short video at SmartHER News, but I really want to emphasize it because it's something that I don't have. We all try to develop plans, right? If If no one has a cell phone service, like, do we have an emergency place to meet? That's something my husband and I talked about recently. If there's a fire in the house, where are we all meeting? You kind of run those drills with your children, right? We're going to meet on the far side of the driveway. Well, if you get COVID, what is your plan? And that's one of the things that Dr. Rutland talks about. Vaccination status, just let it go for a second. Because we know that people can get the flu vaccine, but they still get treated for the flu. So if we're going to really move towards this, well, what is are we having conversations with our doctors about, okay, if we get COVID again this year, let's say you tested positive for COVID once, what's your plan? Are you going to try to get an antiviral pill? Are you just going to try to ride it out with supplements? How do you judge when's the time really to go into the doctors and get looked at? And I think that's a really good tip for families everywhere. I think we should talk about that. We don't have to be afraid, but we should have a conversation about it. I know if I have the flu and I test positive for the flu, I've taken Tamiflu before. There's always mixed results about whether or not it really shortens your case of the flu. But if I got the flu again, like I did when I was pregnant with my third child, I'd probably be more aggressive about it because that was a really tough time. So depending on your point of reference with COVID, this may mean different things with you, but it might not be a bad idea to talk about it with your doctor or, whoever you go to for medical advice to say, like, if this is the case, what should I do? One of the things I'm going to be watching, and I've said this repeatedly, but I think this is important, what happens in the South in the summer with COVID cases. We've seen a repeated spike in the Northeast over the last couple of years during this time of year. But then in like June and July, really June, we see it in the South. And it's sort of been like, why is that happening? It's not damp and cold and wet like you would think it's typical for respiratory viruses. And it's been a little bit of like, I guess the South, they're crazy. They don't wear masks. You know what I mean? Like people have just like said that. By the way, not true. I actually think I notice more people wearing masks now in places like the grocery store than I did even last year at this time. I don't know. So I'm really curious about that. But here's something I think parents should know about, and really anybody. So the World Health Organization came out a couple weeks ago, and they kind of said, listen, we're looking at this strange cases of hepatitis in kids. It's hitting children 0 to 17 years old. I actually have a map. Let me see if I can pull it up here. And I don't think it transferred. I wanted to show it. I'm going to put this underneath our video on YouTube. I'm going to put it on our website, and I'm also going to tuck this into our newsletter. I think this is important. So there's cases of hepatitis, a handful, in a variety of different countries. The United States is included, European countries, Spain, England, and they're noticing these kids have symptoms related to hepatitis, but they're not testing positive for the viruses that typically cause hepatitis. What they're testing positive for is adenovirus. This is like a typical cold virus. And in some cases, they're testing positive for the adenovirus and COVID, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID. In some cases, they're not testing for either. And they can't quite figure out, well, what is happening here? Hepatitis causes an inflamed liver. It can be really dangerous. Obviously, we all need our liver to function and be healthy. And in a couple cases, so in this recent press release, they said 169 children across these different countries. And that 10% of them, so about 17 of them, needed liver transplants because of this. One died. They're not presenting with fever. They're presenting with, severe abdominal pain. But it's enough to catch the attention of the World Health Organization. I think that's enough for us to also watch. One infectious disease doctor I watch in San Francisco from UCSF is Dr. Gandhi. She's a mom as well. And she was talking a little bit about this. And this is kind of brings up one of those questions about, with a question about hygiene was what she was talking about, and keeping some children from exposure to certain viruses because we've in many cases been isolated for a period of time, whether or not this is kind of what we're seeing or whether or not this is something completely different. We don't really know. Does it seem to be like contagious, like we're talking about with COVID, how we were really worried about transmission and close places? That's not what the World Health Organization is saying right now. But as a parent, certainly got my attention. So it's really very, very little kids, younger than 1 year old to about 17 years old, and just something that I wanted to pass on. And one of those reminders that health really matters. It's not just a focus on COVID. It's about healthcare. It's about taking care of each other and watching and asking for the right questions. as well. Okay, final story I wanted to cover with you, and this has to do with a prisoner swap. Have you heard about this? We had a prisoner swap with Russia this week. Yeah. So this involved a Marine, not active duty. Not active duty, yes, to my understanding. One of the things when you talk about Marines, you never say a former Marine, because once a Marine, always a Marine. So I just want to, to my Marines out there, I want to show the most respect. So Trevor Reed was in Russia. He was arrested for assaulting or having some sort of situation with 2 Russian police officers. Quite frankly, we don't know all the backstory to this. We also don't know really the whole backstory for why we were holding this Russian citizen in the United States. Well, that he was trying to sell drugs, cocaine in the United States, and he's been held for a long time. Trevor Reed's been held since 2020. These 2 individuals were exchanged this week, and I do believe I have a photo if you are watching us. So this is Trevor Reed's parents. They're actually based in Texas, and this is Trevor Reed. We have a picture from him and his family. This is when he was able to come home. The reason why I want to just flag this is a couple things. One, the negotiations over this particular prisoner swap predate the war in Ukraine slightly, just slightly. But the fact that it happened despite what's going on there and obviously the conflict between America and Russia, says something about diplomatic channels being open somewhat. I don't know how much to read into it, but I thought the timing of this is important. At the same time, you have Russia really doubling down on a couple things. You have Russia cutting off natural gas to Poland, as well as Bulgaria, because they're not paying in rubles, they're not paying in the Russian currency, and Russia really needs that. And so Russia's cutting that off. Russia's also had a couple of very high-profile references from the foreign minister in the government, as well as Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, talking about the potential for broader war, nuclear war. You're still getting those references. So you're getting that, those heightened references. You're seeing the high stakes of this conflict, but then you're also seeing this take place. I don't really know what to read about it. My job as a journalist isn't to necessarily tell you what I think about. I don't really know what to think about this. I think it's important that it happened. And clearly, for it to happen, someone had to be talking to each other. In the meantime, we do have one of the most popular women basketball players, Brittany Griner. She's being held in Russia. She's been held in Russia for several months. And by the way, we didn't know that she was arrested and held in Russia when it happened. It took a couple weeks. This is very typical in my experience covering these stories. When an American citizen is arrested for circumstances that seem very questionable, she had apparently some sort of vaping instrument, and it was something like that at the airport. It wasn't that they said you can't bring that in, whatever it was. It was something very minor for her to be held in prison for several months, and really we don't really know a lot about what's happening there. Seems disproportionate, but other countries do have different rules. We have our own rules. So what I've seen with these situations is that the U.S. government often will tell a family, don't talk about it. We're not going to talk about this publicly. Let us work our back channels and see what we can do. Then eventually they find out, well, we're not getting many places, so now we're going to go public with this. And that's when you start seeing families become more aggressive because they're getting frustrated. So I think it's important for you to know that Brittany Griner is still in Russia, and there's still a question about her status and what's going to happen next. At the same time, we saw this pretty high-profile prisoner swap take place. And so what's next? What's happening behind the scenes? I think that's the other thing I take away from this as a journalist. It's a reminder that a lot of what we see obviously a lot from what we see from the U.S. government, we hope for transparency all the time. We hope for transparency from all governments, but we also know that there's positioning and there's leverage. And so it's just a reminder that a lot's happening behind the scenes that we may not be totally aware of. And it's good to have a little bit of humility around that. Let me just show you what's happening in Ukraine, if I can briefly. This is another map from the Institute of the Study of War. And, this is why I think some of the news about Russia cutting off natural gas to Poland, for example, seemed kind of, whoa, what's going on? Because really Russia has pulled back to the eastern part of Ukraine, and we continue to see developments along this area where we've seen fighting for the last several years. We're also seeing references to the People's Republic of Kherson, which is sort of, I guess, this term that's being used in some way to kind of suggest that, hey, we're going to take this part of the country, and this is going to be quote unquote independent territory. It may be Russia might claim it, but this was a term that the Institute of the Study of War that looks at strategically, tactically what's happening on the ground, develops these maps, was referencing, that there's references to that already being said. So this idea that this is going to be, I don't want to say autonomous, what we don't know what it'll become. But you can see that Russia, this is where Russia has fought for many years. The areas that are striped, if you're not watching us, you're seeing the areas that are striped. One are in the Donbas, what's called the Donbas area, as well as Crimea. Those are areas that were already considered, contested or mostly controlled by or more affiliated with Russia. So will this broader swath then be pulled over as well? And that's what we're going to be watching next. So those are just a couple things to note. I think those things, what's happening in Russia is obviously very important. One of the other things that I always want to be very sensitive to, we want to quote people. And when people say threatening things, we want to quote them, and we also want to give them context. I'm talking a little bit about what Russia's talking about regarding nuclear war. I do think there's sometimes an overcorrection in the American press to say, yeah, they're saying this, but they don't really mean it. No, in most cases, people say what they really mean, and you have to take what they're saying. This is why we quote people directly on SmartHER News, and we don't use salacious headlines to try to promote a story. I want you to see exactly what they're saying, because exactly what they're saying is valuable. Whether or not they mean it, we may never know, but you need to see exactly what they're saying because they're saying it for a reason. So again, just something that we need to keep our eye on. So we covered a lot of ground here. I would love to hear from you guys about any questions that you had. I had a couple different questions about what's going on with the economy. I had a couple different questions as well about what's happening with this, with COVID, and also with this sort of mysterious hepatitis illness that we're seeing amongst children. But if you have any questions before I jump off for the day, I'd love that. For those of you not watching live, this is just a great opportunity. I love being able to talk to people live. I like being able to speak to a live audience. I even though I can't see you all the time, I feel that support. I love seeing your questions, and it always gives me a different take on the news. And I'm here to serve you. So I actually want to know what you think. That's very important to me. So even if you're not watching live and you're commenting on the video later, if you want to direct message me, if you want to email us as well, I'm happy to I always kind of weigh in as much as I can on social media, but I engage a lot of people that way. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I also think it's very interesting when media companies that are in place to serve people don't have executives that do that. I'm in sort of a rare position. I'm the executive. You could call me, I am the CEO of SmartHER News. I created SmartHER News. I'm also a working journalist that's part of SmartHER News. And there's nothing keeping any of these major networks from having their executives talk to the audience directly. I think it should happen. I think you should know exactly who's behind, who's formulating the team that's gathering news, that's telling the story of our lives. Okay, final thing I'm going to just mention. And I know some of you are tired about this, but I can't let it. I can't not mention Elon Musk and buying attempting to buy Twitter. Can I just say this real quick? Yes, the offer was accepted, but it's sort of like economic data. You get a first reading. You may get your offer accepted on a house, but then it takes a while for it to close, and a couple things can happen. I don't know what could disrupt this deal, but I also think it's sort of funny that people are just losing their minds over this when it's not even final yet. I'm like, it's like, okay, they came together. There's some sort of offer that's been accepted. Okay, I got it. And it's sort of interesting to hypothesize about how a change of a social media platform might lead to other change, and freedom of speech. This kind of gets us full circle to the First Amendment that we talked about with the court case that we're looking at this week. But a lot can happen. What can happen before the deal closes? I just want to mention that. I don't know. I think the whole thing is very interesting. And if the focus is on more information and more opinions and more access, well, let's see. I use Twitter a lot for direct quotes, and that's very useful to me as a journalist. If Twitter went away, I wouldn't be, very upset personally. I find it interesting. Professionally, I would find that to be a huge blow because people say things on Twitter that they may not say otherwise, and they're in positions of power, like the wealthiest person on the planet, like Elon Musk, or, legislators. The photo that I used of Trevor Reed, the Marine that was in prison in Russia, I got from the Texas congressman who is serving the district where his family is. I would never have access to that otherwise. So there's actually, for me, there's a lot of positive. I'm not even really worried about some of the arguing that happens or misinformation. And I actually am really not worried about you when it comes to misinformation. I worry about you all the time, by the way, but I'm not really worried about you when it comes to misinformation. I think if misinformation is online, it's just like misinformation at church or at school. And we all navigate bad information on a regular basis. I think you can navigate this. I think when something is real and when something's suspect, or when you're kind of curious about something and you can take a closer look. I actually trust you. I don't really think there needs to be that heavy-handedness of moderation to protect you. I think that actually doesn't protect you. That said, I think Twitter's gotten itself into a lot of trouble, over the years when we've looked at, and these are situations that don't get talked about very often. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all these terrorist groups have been super active on social media. I mean, videos of them doing horrible things stay up there for a long time. And sometimes they're taken down and sometimes they're not. And again, as a journalist, do I want more access to information and images and all of that? Yeah, I think that's helpful for us to tell the story. When things cross over into real crimes, I'm clearly not advocating for that, but it's certainly been a mixed message at times about what's acceptable and what's not. So we're living in a very interesting age. I'll show you this. My father sent me this San Francisco Examiner. It's from the beginning of the year, and it's all these pictures of the San Francisco papers emerging from the pandemic. San Francisco was very much affected by what happened in the flu pandemic, 1918, 1919. Really bad. You think about that environment, cold, foggy weather, the flu loves that. And it was real bad there. The arguments and the fighting over masking in 1918, 1990, exactly what we're going through. It's like, exactly. I shared this cartoon on Instagram stories. If I can figure out a way to put it online, I'll show it to you. There was even cartoons making fun of people masking in different ways. Those that had their masks under their nose or over their beards, or too many masks or not enough masks, or those that are trying to smoke. That might be something that we haven't really seen as much in public, right? You can't really smoke that much in public anymore. But can you imagine what that was like, with their pipes and their cigars and things like that? Where there's a will, there's a way, I'm sure of it. But it's not necessarily new. So one of the reasons I bring that up, though, is that we have to remember what emerged after that time period was a lot of great creativity. And I think we're at the verge of some really great creativity if we can kind of pull out of this environment that we've been kind of held into for so long, for obvious reasons. And we've clearly had a lot of loss of life and a lot of turmoil in this country over the last couple of years. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for what I call, creative disruption. And I think Smarter News is about creative disruption. And I think that's important. So that makes me excited. Anyways, okay, guys, sorry about that. We had a little bit of a slight audio break. Hopefully we can fix that in some of the after production. I'm trying something else to see if I can get my audio to sound a little bit better. But I appreciate all your patience and support for Smarter News and helping us grow. Thank you for telling your family and friends about us. That means the world to me and our entire team. And without you, this would mean nothing. It's really about you. You bring the value. Remember, most important for the U.S. economy, the global economy, and the most important for Smarter News. Don't forget who you are on those days where you're like, oh, what is happening? Very important to me, and I appreciate it. All right, questions and comments, let me know. I'm going to have more on all these stories, including updates about what's happening on the border, immigration, on smarternews.com. And don't forget our weekly newsletter as well. It's one of my favorite things we put together, and that comes out every Saturday morning, so you don't have to look anywhere if you want something interesting to read just for a couple minutes on the weekend. So thank you so much, and I'll see you with more on smarternews.com. Bye, guys.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, Smarter News, a refuge from the storm.
I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.